us to come and do this presentation over a whole series of time. We're getting a little feedback that might be, if it starts, maybe we can cut back the gain a little bit. Yeah, okay. At any rate, Defending Utah has asked me to do a whole series of these, and we started a year or two ago, but not on the Constitution specifically. We went with baseline principles, and then we kind of decided, let's just do the Constitution clause by clause and move through this to get an understanding that'll help us all restore that great document. Last week, it's about 2 weeks ago now, I was asked to speak up at the Idaho State Capitol in regards to an effort that's being done across the nation. It's highly organized, cleverly disguised, powerfully promoted, very, very well funded, an effort to get a Constitution Convention called. And we find most people don't know what's at risk with the Constitution Convention. And so, they have all sorts of wonderful promises they make, those that are in favor of it. And they are absolutely determined that they're going to convention call together so that they can rewrite our Constitution. People just don't know what's at stake. And I just hope that what we're doing with this presentation will help with the baseline understanding that we have a most wonderful Constitution, let's put it that way. And that Constitution is at risk. And if we lose that Constitution, we are it'll be a long clawback to begin to somehow regain the blessings of liberty and proper government that we will have lost. And so with more friends that know the pathway along the Constitution, hopefully we'll be able to defend it. So that's what Defending Utah felt that this would be appropriate for, because Utah's not the only one at stake, but certainly Utah is at high risk because, number one, Utah has called for a Constitution Convention, and Utah is trying again this year to call so that they might add to that call, and they're trying to keep the interest high because, highly organized, cleverly disguised, powerfully promoted. So anyway, what we've been doing, we've done the Constitution clause by clause. Article 1, of course, is the job description of the legislature. So we took a few sessions on that. Article 2 is the president's job description. It's pretty simple. It really, truly is. Last time we got together, we did part 1. We covered a lot of things like presidential eligibility and so on, which is a big issue because a very high percentage of the people that are currently or have been running for president this election cycle are ineligible constitutionally to be able to even serve. And there's at least one still in the race that is being fostered by those that, she's the darling, if you will. If you can't figure it out, let's go back and look at what the ballot looks like. She's the darling of the globalist establishment, and she's not constitutionally eligible. So we talked about that kind of stuff last time. This get-together, we're going to talk about part 2 of the executive's job description, Article 2. So as you can see up here, this is a brief description of the things we're going to talk about. He's the commander-in-chief, but certainly not a commander-in-chief as has been assumed, basically since 1949. And so it's a real different from what the war that was just started with Yemen and the Houthis was an unconstitutional war. The war before that, the Syrian thing, which is still going on, the war before that, and we could go back because there has not been a constitutionally declared war in my lifetime. And certainly the executive has a usurped power that cannot be handed over, and it's a legislative authority. And if you've watched the previous sessions, if you will, Article 1 explains that very specifically, but we'll go into that a little bit in this get-together. We're going to talk about executive orders and what's constitutional and what's not. Most of them aren't, by the way. We're going to talk about presidential powers, responsibilities the president has, and a few reasons for impeachment, which are looming even as we speak. So there's plenty to talk about, and we're just going to have to kind of fly low to get through this and save a little bit of time at the end of the get-together so that we can have some questions too. So, President's Job Description, Part 2. All right, we'll just start. Okay, we already covered Article 2, Section 1, our last get together, so we're doing Article 2, Section 2 to begin with on this one. So the President is the Commander-in-Chief of the Army, Navy, and militia when called into the actual service. Okay, so the militia normally is not under the control or command or any responsibility of the President. The militia is us. Okay, those men that wrote the Bill of Rights were very specific about that. The militia is not the National Guard. Okay, even though they've tried to equate these, it's a conflation of that. They're conflating between the two. The National Guard didn't come around until about 120 years ago. Okay, but the militia has always been with us, and the militia. Well, George Mason, one of the principal authors of the Bill of Rights and certainly the Second Amendment, said, "Who is the militia? It's us. It's everybody but a few elected officials." I don't want to be one of those elected officials because I want to be able to defend, as should be, by the militia. But at any rate, so the President's Commander-in-Chief. Does that mean he can order us all into battle and everything like that, just like a whim or anything like that? We're going to find out not so. So we go back to Article 1, which is the legislative job description. And each little clause of Article 1, Section 8 could begin with the statement, Congress shall have power to create laws to define and punish piracy, felonies on the high seas, and offenses against the law of nations. We've talked about the law of nations in previous discussions, and that's where this natural-born citizen concept comes out of. It's a book that was written by Vattel, 1758, and the United States leadership used that book to help. He was a diplomat, a statesman, an author, a philosopher out of Switzerland. And his concept, his book was called The Law of Nations. And that was well defined in his book. And that's where we get the definition of a natural-born citizen. And that's how we can tell that the people that are running for president now aren't natural-born citizens, based upon his clearly defined explanation of what a natural-born citizen is. The book's name is Law of Nations. And so it's an international playbook, if you will. Very, very detailed, excruciatingly written. And so this thing about offenses against the law of nations is something the founders clearly understood, and these things like declaring war, piracy, and all those kinds of things were well understood from Vattel's book. But Congress shall have power to declare war. That's the thing we want to talk about for a few moments here. Grant letters of marque and reprisal. So these are basically letters that can be given to private operators, if you will, that says you can carry out war on behalf of the United States. And it harkens back to some problems that started with, it's this marque and reprisal thing was a long-known process and understood, and nations knew about them, and certainly was written about by Vattel in the Law of Nations. But marque and reprisal was, they needed to make certain that if the United States subcontracted the war-making power to someone, and it could only be done by Congress, could not be done by anybody else, and we'll talk about why Congress has that power just shortly. But it says basically the holder of this letter is duly authorized to operate a ship on the high seas and carry out war against England, for example, which was the case that was happening in the Revolutionary War. We didn't have a navy, really, and so we wanted as many people out there as we could get that were carrying out the things that we were trying to achieve, but they didn't want to get captured and hanged as a pirate. Because that was what would happen if you were out there firing on other ships and you got captured and, oh my golly, you're just a pirate here, we're going to hang you. And they did that summary execution. So with letters of marque and reprisal, these guys could say if they were captured, nope, I'm operating as a duly authorized individual of the United States government. Okay, so it kept people from being hanged if they got captured. So that's a little more explanation that I had hoped to give as we got together. But if people haven't attended previous sessions, it's nice to know where some of these terms come from. There's a much larger, explanation we could give, but basically it's subcontracting war. And now there was a treaty in Paris back in the 1860s that said, no, we can't do that anymore, but it's still in the Constitution. And literally and truthfully, if you want to be really strict about this, the Constitution authorized for Congress to say, we're going to give letters of marque and reprisal to some individuals. If, let's say, they were going after Osama bin Laden. These individuals are contracted to go do that. We could have done it without sending any American expeditionary forces out there or anything like that. And I personally knew well individuals that would have signed up for that kind of action and been happy to carry it out. But we haven't used letters of marque and reprisal for a long time. But nonetheless, the Constitution says that. And Congress shall have power to determine handling of war captures. Gitmo, you ever heard of that? Guantanamo Bay? Okay, a lot of people are saying, oh, president's in charge of that. President's got to decide what. No, Congress really has the responsibility to do that. So all of these things, these war-making powers, and we're going to go on to the next slide in just a moment, have to do with the military operations also. But most people have never considered, because certainly none in this room have been around long enough to understand that everything that's been carried out in terms of war-making powers by the United States since the end of World War II has been unconstitutionally done. Congress has not really authorized any of these things. They passed little trash and trinket kind of laws, like the War Powers Act and stuff like that. They cannot, and you'll see in a few moments, that violates constitutional protocol. For a Congress to pass off that war-making power, they cannot do that. It was delegated to them by the people through the ratification process in the Constitution, and they can't pass it on to anybody. We'll understand that better as we get through this. So everything that's happened, wartime powers issues, has been in violation of the Constitution. But let's go on to this, and hopefully we'll build on some of these things that we're discussing at this moment. Anyway, again, back in Article 1, Section 8, it says, Congress shall have power to raise and support armies, no more than 2-year periods. Now, that we could do a long discussion about the 2-year period. I've talked to people that consider themselves to be quite the constitutional scholar. I've had some people come to me and say, no. Any war that goes on longer than 2 years is unconstitutional. Well, how absurd. Let's say we're in the middle of World War II and we're just getting the upper hand. Oh, 2 years is up. Let's go home. What happens? We basically abrogate that responsibility of seeing this through to the end. This has to do with funding military operations for longer than 2 years. So we got to pass a budget that allows them to exist, because the Founding Fathers were very worried about standing armies. Standing armies had always been used to capture nations. I mean, if you got a standing army there and they say, oh yeah, those standing armies here that are in your town are here to protect us. Really? Really? No, they're here to capture you if you get a little bit out of line. And that's exactly what was happening with the quartering of troops, in the pre-revolutionary period, where the king's officers were saying, you know what? Golly, we don't have any barracks around here. They're going to stay in your house. Well, they had you live they had the soldiers live right with you. And that's a pretty intimidating kind of situation. And Founding Fathers didn't want that to happen. And so they did not want standing armies. They did not want the troops quartered among the people, because they were there to not protect, but to subjugate in most instances in history. Maintain the Navy. By the way, a lot of people they don't argue particularly, but they make statements like, oh, no, we don't have an Air Force. We can't have an Air Force because it says support armies and it says Navy there. There ain't no Air Force, so they must not be allowed. If you think back in World War II, what did they call the Air Force then? The Army Air Corps, right? Okay, so let's change the name back if you really want to argue about it. But the fact of the matter is, our military personnel are tied to the actions and operations and authorization of the United States legislature. They are not tied to the executive. And we've really strayed a long ways from that. So they can raise armies, support them, but don't fund them for more than 2 years so they don't get to be such a military caste thing that they're embedded in society and they ultimately and finally become the driving force in society. We're not a militaristic country, although we're moving that way because we constantly kind of foster that kind of legislation. Okay, Congress shall have power to make rules to govern and regulate the U.S. military. So who decides if we can have LGBTQ, WXYZ, or any of these other things that are transitioning or whatever that's happening right now? Congress makes those rules. The executive branch constitutionally cannot say, this is what we're going to do. We're going to pay for anybody that comes in and wants to transition to a different gender, which can't be done, but they want to mutilate themselves. But the fact of the matter is, Congress has to step up and take that responsibility. Okay, Congress shall have power to call up the militia and determine their use. Okay, there are long explanations with all of these, but I'm trying to make just the point that Congress is oversight so many ways about the military, and we're going to find out that the intent of the Founding Fathers was such that basically, and you'll see this when we read Hamilton's Federalist paper on this, basically the president, when they are doing this, he's just the first admiral or the first general. President doesn't take you to war, Congress does. The president has oversight, ordering, and all that kind of stuff that happens once the war's there, but it's a very, very limited assignment. So we'll get into that. First, though, I want to talk about something that one of the Founding Fathers' mentors spoke very eloquently, very powerfully. This guy, John Locke, was basically one of the mentors of the American Founding Fathers. He lived a generation before, but they read his works along with Montesquieu's and Blackstone's. They were the principal mentors, if you will. And it's interesting, we can tie in the Holy Book, the Scriptures, to things that needed to be done that the Founding Fathers incorporated into the form of government we ended up with. But I'm going to read this because I'm going to show you this a time or two in the future, but we'll get the basis of it, and I might just come back and touch on it just so it will remind you of some of the pertinent issues. Here's what John Locke said about constitutional protocol. The legislative, so the legislature, cannot transfer the power of making laws to any other hands. For it being but a delegated power from the people, they who have it cannot pass it over to others. The people alone can appoint the form of the Commonwealth, which is by constituting the legislative, and appointing is whose hands that shall be. And when the people have said, we will submit and be governed by laws made by such men and in such forms, nobody else can say, other men shall make laws for them, nor can they be bound by any laws but such as are enacted by those whom they have chosen and authorized to make the laws for them. Okay, so our representatives can only legislate within the limits and bounds that are authorized within Constitution, okay? And Locke's saying they can't hand that off. The people said, we're going to be governed by these people that operate within these things, and we ratified a Constitution about that. Therefore, they are bound to only operate within that. They can't say anybody else can do it. Nobody else can do that. And the people have a right to defend that, because honestly, if we don't, what do we have? We have a blank piece of paper, and we've lost our Constitution. So these things are not transferable, or may not be, if you will, delegated, okay? And I'll just say it now, and you'll see it more powerfully in a little while. No, you can't say, oh, we've made a treaty that says if this group of people get attacked, we have to go to war. Let's just say there was a treaty called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization from 1949. You need to get it out. Article 5 in that says specifically, if anybody in NATO gets attacked, we go to war against the other side. It's been delegated by treaty. That's how we got involved in Korea, for example. That's how we got involved in Southeast Asia with the SEATO Treaty, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization Treaty. Okay, so that has been unconstitutional from the get-go. constitutional protocol, well understood by the founding fathers. They said, we're going to say when we go to war, with whom, how we're going to fight it, who's going to fight, what kind of equipment we're going to use, whatever. They didn't say it that specifically, but you get the point. Because we said we go to war based upon legislative action. The legislature can't hand it off. We'll find this more in a minute, to anybody. The executive or another nation or an organization or anything, nothing at all, ever, under any circumstances, can they hand that off. Okay, we'll come back to this, but I wanted that foundation to be there. So let's go to Federalist Paper number 69. Alexander Hamilton wrote that. He explained the war-making powers the president had, as outlined, stated, directed, however you want to put it, by the United States Constitution. So here's what he said. We're going to quote out of this for a little while. So some of these things I wished I could just read you the whole Federalist Paper. And most people say, it's taking too long. I say, no, there's a whole bunch of information in here. So I have to kind of tether myself a little bit and say, we'll just use some pertinent things for you to get the point. Okay. See, what happens in this Federalist Paper, people were well aware of the military power the King of England had. And we just got over a war with that guy, okay? They were well aware of the military power of the governor of New York, okay? Hamilton was from New York, and that was one of his downfalls. But at any rate, that's another story. Him and Burr didn't get along. They were opposing attorneys, and you know the story there maybe. But so here Hamilton writes this Federalist Paper number 69. And he says, first, the president will have only the occasional command of such part of the militia. What's that? That's all of the rest of us. We're not in the regular army, okay? Shall only have part of all of us that are available to defend our nation. The militia of the nation as by legislative provision. Who's that? That's by the Congress saying it, okay? May be called into the actual service of the Union. The King of Great Britain and the Governor of New York have at all times the entire command of the militia within their several jurisdictions. So the King of England anytime can say, hey, you guys that are out there, come here, you're going to have to go fight for me. Or the governor could do that in New York, okay? But he's saying that isn't what's with no, the president doesn't have that, no. In this article, therefore, the power of the president would be inferior to that of either the monarch or the governor. So he's saying constitutionally, we're not giving any power to the president to do what the governor could do in his state, or the King of England could do in his nation. Okay, going on. Second, the president is to be the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. In this respect, his authority would be nominally the same with that of the King of England, the King of Great Britain, but, everybody has a big but, right? Okay, but in substance, much inferior to it. Okay? It would amount to nothing more than the supreme command and direction of the military and naval forces as first general and admiral of the Confederacy. So you can't take the nation to war. That's the legislative authority. And we'll read more about this as we go on. Military, supreme command and direction of the military and naval forces as first general and admiral of the Confederacy. Okay, so he's like commanding officer in military form. He wears the highest rank, if you will. While that of the British king extends to the declaring of war and the raising and regulating of fleets and armies. No, see, that isn't there in this Constitution. King can do it, but we limited that in the Constitution. Okay, all which by the Constitution under consideration would appertain to the legislature. He's very specific about this. You go back and read Federalist 69, you'll understand what they intended. And it's interesting to me that, first I maybe ought to say, the Federalist Papers were written to convince people that, yes, they ought to ratify the Constitution. So he's explaining the terminology and use of what was written into the United States Constitution. St. George Tucker, I always introduce him as probably the preeminent constitutional scholar of the American founding era. This man was absolutely belligerently brilliant. I mean, this guy had it together when it comes to he wasn't at the Constitution Convention, by the way. Since there's people in the group that have never been in a little session with us before, he wasn't in the Constitution Convention. Why? Because he had been assigned the task of rewriting the entire legal code of Virginia single-handedly during the period of time that the Constitution Convention was meeting. This guy, boy, he was smooth as butter when it came to writing stuff out. And he wrote a wonderful book. It's called View of the Constitution of the United States. You'll see it noted in some of the documents we'll show tonight. But, excuse me, he was, just to give you another little background, many of you have probably heard of Blackstone's Commentaries on the Law. It was Commentaries on the Laws of England. Blackstone was a brilliant, brilliant man, legal mind in England. 1865 to 1869, he wrote the commentaries, 4 volumes that were published in England, 1865 to 69, sent to America. Founding fathers devoured it. Well, when we became a new nation, we were different than these commentaries on the laws of England. And so this guy, St. George Tucker, he thought, well, I'm going to rewrite those commentaries to Americanize them. So he started to. Found out he couldn't. Why? Because we were and are so different from the things that the king had going. And so he wrote a book called View of the Constitution of the United States. We'll quote from it a number of times as we go through this evening. But he realized you can't just Americanize it by changing a few names here and there. We really are different. We have so many things that they don't have. And he documented that then. So we'll see this out of commentaries, out of View of the Constitution. So, in writing that View of the Constitution, he said, the power declaring war with all its train of consequences, direct and indirect, forms the next branch of the powers confided to Congress. Okay, so having to do with war. Yeah, it is. It's there. And happy it is for the people of America that it is so vested. The term war embraces the extremes of human misery and iniquity. Think about this for a minute. Every single stinking thing that we can do wrong is amplified by war. Everything. It's legalized, institutionalized mass murder, and anything that's associated with anything that can be diabolical goes into it in spades. So it embraces the extremes of human misery and iniquity, and is alike the offspring of the one and the parent of the other. What else is the history of war from the earliest ages to the present moment? By the way, this was published in 1803 during Jefferson's first administration. To the present moment, but in afflicting detail of the sufferings and calamities of mankind resulting from the ambition, usurpation, animosities, resentments, piques, intrigues, avarice, rapacity, oppressions, murders, assassinations, and other crimes of the few possessing power. He's saying all these guys that got all this power, man, they bring all this bad stuff on the whole people. Okay, going on. How rare are the instances of a just war? Okay, think of anything that's happened in recent century, basically. Okay, how few of those which are thus denominated have had their existence in a national injury. The personal claims of the sovereign are confounded with the interests of the nation. See, the sovereign guy says, oh, I'm offended. My nation's going to come to war and clean your plow. Okay, no. It's the sovereign that pulls the strings on these things in other countries. The claims of the sovereign are confounded with the interests of the nation over which he presides, and his private grievances or complaints are transferred to the people, who are thus made the victims of a quarrel in which they have no part, until they become principals in it by their sufferings. You think about the Napoleonic Wars, for example. Hey, the people are out there plowing the ground, harvesting their crops and everything. Napoleon comes along and says, you're going to join my army and we're going to go out and kill all the people we can in this. Napoleon marched and, tromped across Europe and killed 6 million people in hand-to-hand combat, basically. And the people were just going about their lives. And Napoleon said, nope, I'm the emperor for life. They did that, okay? By the way, the founding fathers had an extremely egregious view of Napoleon. Anyway. Okay, so the people get pulled into it and they start to suffer, and then it becomes their war. It was kind of like the Audrang Valley in 1965. Most of you probably never heard about it, but it became our war in Southeast Asia with the Audrang Valley battle. And it never should have been. The Vietnamese recognized that immediately. And the Americans didn't for a couple more years, but it became our war because we were where we shouldn't have been doing what we shouldn't have been doing at the time we did it. But at any rate, suddenly it's our war because of what happened. Okay, going on. War, with Tucker, would be banished from the face of the earth were nations instead of princes to decide upon their necessity. Injustice can never be the collective sentiment of a people emerged from barbarism. Happy the nation where the people are the arbiters of their own interest and their own conduct. Happy were it for the world did the people of all nations possess this power. He said, you know what, if all the people on the nations of the earth could make their own decision on this, we'd have a lot less war, okay? So that's, again, out of the view of the Constitution of the United States, which was published in 1803. Great book. I recommend it for everybody. If you love liberty and proper government, you'll be cheering all the way through it. It's kind of like reading on a steroid scale the Law by Bastiat. The Law is just a tiny little book. Read it in one evening and you'll think, if you love liberty, man, read this book, baby. Bastiat was a little French guy, died in 1850, loved the American founding fathers. So the only grief he really had with the Americans, by the way, was we hadn't taken care of the problem of slavery, and this pesky thing of tariffs was bugging the heck out of him. And we ended up doing a war over that kind of stuff, at least in part. Okay, so Tucker's view on war. And so let's go on. What happened was, to take care of that problem that Tucker pointed out so eloquently, and he was, amplifying when he wrote that or at least he published it in 1803. What the Constitution did is it delegated the war-making power to the national body closest to the people. See, if you read Federalist 45, you'll find that in essence, and there's nuanced things on this too when it comes to weights and measures and coining money and things like that, but in essence, the general government, national government, federal government, a lot of people call it different names. I call it a general government because it is neither general nor federal. It's both. That's another discussion at some point, perhaps. But this body was to have the responsibility of looking externally to the nation, basically. War, treaties, tariffs for imports, and so on and so forth, okay? Internal, the states were to handle things, which is, whoa, it's been flipped on its head. And if we get to the point some months down the road of discussing the amendments, the Bill of Rights, the 10th Amendment specifically, we'll discuss those kinds of things. But in particular, the topic for this evening, this idea of war-making power. See, the American founding fathers knew that we would have to go to war sometimes. Bad people do bad things, absolutely. But there had to be a deliberative, reasoned process by which we go to war. So they said, you know what? Because the people are going to shed their lives and their blood, they're going to shed their fortunes, and they're going to put at risk their honor, we ought to have the group closest to the people make that decision. So they put it to the United States Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House originally, still do, answer to the people, or they get their power from the people. People directly elect them. Till the stupid 17th Amendment in 1913, the Senate got their power, if you will, from the states. So the states had a seat at the table. The states were going to have blood and fortune in this thing too. So that's where the United States founding fathers delegated this war-making power to those closest to those that would suffer under it. So everything, lives, fortune, sacred honor, these are the guys, the people. It was going to, if I'll tell you what, if Lindsey Graham has his way and we bomb Iran tomorrow, their oil fields and their National Guard, or whatever they're called, Revolutionary Guard, they call themselves, your boys and girls, your brothers and sisters, your moms and dads are going to be the ones that shed their blood and die on those fields. And if we go to war with Iran, it's going to be a lot different than it ever was with Saddam Hussein. Freudian slips happen sometimes. It's going to be a whole bunch different war. And if you scripturally want to go look, go check what the scriptures say about going to war with the Medes and the Persians. That's who the Iranians are, in case you're wondering. Don't do it, it says. It's got a bad outcome. Okay, So the founding fathers of America said this wasn't just for Iran, it was for everybody. If we're going to go to war, the people closest to the people have to make the decision. Their representatives, it's a republic, so the representatives make the decision, but the people chose those that were going to do it. Okay, so again, we're going to go back to this guy, John Locke. He said, the legislative cannot transfer the power of making laws to any other hands. It's a delegated power. Those who have it cannot pass it over to others. We read this earlier. We don't need to read the whole thing. They cannot hand it off in any way, shape, or form. Okay, not by a war powers bill or anything like that. It cannot be done. Not by a Tonkin Gulf resolution. Not by any shape that comes out of the authorization for use of military force, which was passed right after the 9/11/2001 stuff. None of that can say the president can take this power because we said, as your legislature. No, we said as a people, through a constitutional ratification process, you can only make the decision in the House and the Senate. Because those guys are going to have to answer to us. Okay, anyway. Okay, so here's Tucker again. A delegated authority cannot be transferred to another to exercise. We delegated to you guys got to stand tall and decide what you're going to do. Okay, you can't be for it and against it and then for it again, like some politicians have said through the years, if anybody has a memory of that thing. Okay, so you can't constitutionally delegate the power to declare war. It can't be usurped from Congress. Okay, you can't, if you're president, any international body like the United Nations, that's how Truman said we were going to war in Korea. I don't need to go get a war declaration. We have a treaty called that stupid, foolish document that only 2 senators voted against its ratification in 1945. They were the only 2 that had read it. And I've read, in fact, I should have brought a copy. I usually keep a copy, but it's kind of fallen apart now. The back is coming off it and everything. Should have brought a copy of the United Nations Charter. It's a war declaration document. It is not a peace document. It really isn't, but that's another story too. Okay, so no international body can take it over. No NATO, CETO, ANZUS, anything like that. You can't. None of these treaty organizations can take it. By the way, that's why we're so heavily invested in Ukraine, because they're trying to get into NATO. And if we let them in, we are fools. Darn fools, I'll say it a lot more blatantly, but we may have little children. So, okay, nobody has the authority to engage the United States in war. Can't do it. It violates the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson, he wrote about how we'd put the controls on the president and his war-making powers. He wrote, "We have already given an example, one effectual check to the dog of war by transferring the power of declaring war from the executive to the legislative body, from those who are to spend to those who are to pay." Okay, now we're going to read another little thing here in a minute about the way bills get passed. It's not specific to this, but it applies directly to this, and it's Article 1, Section 7, and how bills get passed. The president can pay no money out unless it's legislatively authorized. Article 1, Section 7, Article 1, Section 9. If they don't do it according to that protocol, the president cannot spend the money. Okay, so anyway, Jefferson said, yeah, you take away the power to go, to say I can take the money, and you take away, if you don't have the money, how are you going to go do your job that you want to do? So you control them with the power of the purse. Okay, so that's Thomas Jefferson. Well, James Madison, who was father of the Constitution, that's what they knew him by, he knew about expansive war powers, okay? And he said, we can't let the executive have this power. Now, this quotation here actually occurred in the Convention of 1787 in Philadelphia. They're writing the Constitution. James Madison's taken meticulous notes in this, and he quotes himself. This is what I said in the convention. Okay. He said, in time of actual war, great discretionary powers are constantly given to the executive magistrate. It's like, oh, we're at war, guys. I don't have to come in here and ask you for everything, do I? I'm just going to go do what I need to do, and you guys will say, okay, right? Okay, we're going to go do that. He's saying when we have war, everybody's willing to give the president what he needs to carry it out as the chief admiral or general. Constant apprehension of war has the same tendency to render the head too large for the body. There has not, I don't know, I haven't actually written down and looked at the timeline. I wonder if there's even a moment in my entire lifetime where we have not had war, an apprehension of war. It just sadly, tragically has not happened. But what he says in this, apprehension of war, that's just worrying about it, has the same tendency to render the head too large for the body. Who's the head? The executive. They get this big-headed, I'm the guy in charge, blah, blah, blah. Then he goes on to say, a standing military force with an overgrown executive, you see this bloated head out there, okay, it's your own image, will not long be safe companions to liberty. So if we have standing armies and this bloated executive, we're going to lose our liberty. Listen to this. It kind of reiterates what I said earlier in a much less eloquent means. The means of defense against foreign danger have been always the instruments of tyranny at home. Among the Romans, it was a standing maxim to excite a war whenever a revolt was apprehended. Okay, you guys have seen this in your lifetime. Every time the executive's kind of getting his head pinched for some tawdry affair with an intern or something like that. You may have heard something that's happening. Yeah, we go bomb somebody. Oh, the Houthis. A couple of weeks ago, that's what we started. Hundreds of tons of heavy ordnance, very kinetic kind of assignment, because the executive, his kid is being looked at for this and that and the other that was on his laptop. Okay, you can make all these example connections. Do it yourself. Okay, among the Romans, it was a standing maxim to excite a war whenever a revolt was apprehended. Throughout all Europe, the armies kept up under the pretext of defending have enslaved the people. That's just what happens. That's why they didn't like standing armies, and that's why they didn't like the executive having this full force that we can do whatever we want with the military. They didn't want a caste of military that was going to become kind of the enforcers of the society. Okay, that was said, that statement we just read was said during the Constitution Convention. James Madison kept that perspective his entire life. Towards the end of his life, as it says, it's in volume 4 of his writings, page 492, not 491 at the bottom. He says, of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded, because it comprises and develops the germs of every other. War is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes, and armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. In war, too, the discretionary power of the executive is extended. There he is again. We're going to give this, it's a war. We got to give the executive all the power to do whatever he wants, okay? Okay, so the discretionary power of the executive is extended. Its influence in dealing out offices, honors, and emoluments is multiplied. And all the means of seducing the minds are added to those of subduing the force of the people. No nation, this is a critical point. Make note of it, write it down, tattoo it on your forehead. I don't know what you want to do. But no nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual war. I don't think we have had a moment in my lifetime that we have not had continual war, and our liberty is slipping through our fingers. It's a tragic kind of thing. Okay, so covered that war stuff. Can't be done legally, constitutionally. What's happening, the Houthi attacks, the Syrian attacks. I mean, I don't care if it's Biden's puppet string holders or Donald Trump. These recent presidents have launched these things. We still have troops on the ground in Syria. We are holding ground in Syria that we took. See, it's interesting in Syria. I don't want to take us too much of a side trip here, but you need to understand, we claimed to be invited into Southeast Asia by South Vietnam. Okay? Come on down, they said, we need you to help defend. So we came in there as friends of their, whatever they were trying to accomplish, which is another debate because they were not based on liberty. But nonetheless, we were invited there. Syria, Assad, the leader of Syria, invited Iran to come in there to help them defend against the civil war that was going on. The United States interjected ourselves. We armed, trained, funded, and authorized ISIS. Sorry to say, we always buy our best enemies. And that ISIS got too big for their britches, and they started doing other things. The United States said, whoa, we didn't hire you to do this. It's a long story. But the fact of the matter is, it expanded way beyond what the powers that be wanted this to happen. The United States sent a whole bunch of Tomahawk missiles in and all this kind of stuff. We put troops on the ground. We've had people die, all that kind of stuff, and we still control Syrian oil fields and the Syrian agriculture. I got news for you. If you don't have your agriculture and oil fields, you ain't got much in the country. Okay. So, enough said probably about war-making powers and how it gets out of hands and how far we have strayed over the years by people that have forgotten or pushed aside, or whatever you want to call it, constitutional limits and bounds. Okay. Let's move on for a few minutes when we got to keep moving. In Article 2, Executive Job Description, Section 2, again, we're going back to where that is, presidential power to grant reprieves and pardons, except in the case of impeachment. I mean, you can pardon any sin, except for impeachment. Why not? Well, because impeachment is a pretty definitive done and done kind of thing. If you get impeached, removed from office, you can't hold another office. So the president couldn't just say, whoa, King's X, I like that guy, I'm going to reappoint him as my vice president, whatever, okay? And I'm going to kind of tie this in a little bit to, something that happened in 1974. Okay, now there's a lot of people here that probably don't remember 1974. I do. I remember exactly where I was standing, exactly what I was doing when Nixon resigned. When he got up and he says, I'm out of here, boys and girls. And it wasn't exactly in that language. But we'll talk about this for a few minutes here to make a point. Who was Nixon's vice president? Spiro Agnew. Exactly, you remember. All right, so Agnew got kind of crosswise in his home state of Maryland. And out of embarrassment and all sorts of legal challenges, he had resigned, okay? There was a guy by the name of we're out of a vice president right now. What do we do? So they have this process you go through, and the guy that was the only guy that everybody agreed on to be that guy was Gerald Ford, okay? And there's a whole bunch of things you probably would like to know about Gerald Ford if there were time to talk about it. Gerald Ford, when he got back from World War II and ran for his office, he ran as a progressive. Today, that's a little better known term as a socialist, okay? But nonetheless, that's what he did. He couldn't get elected, and so he ran as a Republican, which we could talk about that in sometime too. But, so everybody agreed, it's time, we got to, Agnew's gone, let's put another guy in for vice president, and that became Gerald Ford. Okay, so Nixon's in there. Things are unraveling because of the Watergate problems that are going on, some things that happened. It was a bungled burglary operation. It was a bunch of bumbling buffoons. Okay. Anyway, so it kind of unraveled. The hearings that were going on, it appeared very much kind of one of those unquestionable things that this guy, Nixon, was going to get not only impeached, that the flow was going against him and he was going to be removed from office. Okay. So that kind of brings us to the point of this thing I'm calling it the pardon power, the Nixon-Ford handoff. Okay. So what happens as this thing unraveled for Richard Nixon was that he could see he was going to be not only impeached. Impeachment is bringing charges. It's like an indictment. The House brings the charges. We talked about this in Article 1, how the House has responsibility to bring charges. They send those over to the Senate. The Senate then tries the charges. If the president is being charged, the U.S. Supreme Court Justice, Chief Justice, sits as the presiding judge, if you will. Because remember who's normally in the Senate is the president of the Senate? It's the vice president. The founding fathers, in their wisdom, said, nope, if the president's being impeached, the vice president can't sit there. And there's two lines of reasoning, at least as I can see. One is the vice president may be standing there in the corner going, if this guy gets kicked out, I'm the president. Yeah, for sure. And that, by the way, that was not outside the realm of discussion. We'll talk about that here shortly. But the other side was, I'm going to protect this guy to the death. I'm going to get in the way of every single stinking argument that gets up. This thing is going to never turn out the way they want it. So the vice president could be either a very adamant kind of advocate for the president or a very adamant, throw him under the bus, I'm next, to go up there. So they said, nope, the Chief Justice has to be the one that sits in the front of the Senate. So Nixon wasn't impeached. And remember what we said? There can be a pardon offered under virtually any other circumstance except for impeachment. And it looked like he was not only going to be impeached, he was going to be removed from office. And if that had happened, Gerald Ford couldn't pardon him. Okay, so because it hadn't gotten to that point, Ford could pardon. Okay, so he issued a proclamation, 4311, which is a pardon. And we're going to read the germane part of it here shortly. So he issued this a month after Nixon left office. Okay, so it was issued the 8th of September, 1974. He granted a full and unconditional pardon to Richard Nixon. I mean, this is for all sins known and unknown. You're going to see what it really actually says. I'd like one of those. And I bet you, anyway, no. I hope I don't need one that desperately. But at any rate, so it encompassed all crimes that Nixon might have committed while he was president. Might have. And you'll see in a minute how big a window they gave him from the moment he took office until the moment he resigned. It was all encompassing. Okay, it's pretty interesting. Okay, so he's resigned August 9th, 1974. He was liable for possible indictment and trial for any offenses that happened during his presidential, not just candidacy, but his office holding. So if they came up with something anytime, anywhere, they could charge him. This became a real scare case, but it depended upon findings of a grand jury that would happen, because that's the way the American system works. And the prosecutor was going to have some discretion in that. And if he got prosecuted, he was entitled to a, due process, fair and impartial jury as guaranteed by the Constitution. This is the American way. So all of this stuff was going to happen if he got, somebody says, wait, I got a crime he did while he was in office. Let's try and look at that. And the prosecutor would have been busy, okay? Not as busy as he should be today, but as busy as he would have been in 1974. So the trial was probably, any trial that was had was not going to begin for at least a year, probably, and maybe longer after this 1974 handoff, okay? So people said, oh man, our nation's been through enough. We've kind of just settled out for a minute. And this is the logic that Ford put forth. We're going to get this disrupted, this tranquility, this animosity, this acrimony, and it's a lot worse today than I think it was. Yeah, Crimea River. So anyway, but that was the way it was said. And you know what? Our acrimony would probably be brought to arms in today's world. There were a lot more reasoned people in 1974. I mean, it was only 50 years ago, people, but it was a different country than it is right now. Half the country hates the other half now. It's a really tragic kind of thing. Marxism brings that around. This fragmentation, this effort to fracture lines and everything like that, that destroys society. And they've done a really pretty good job doing that, particularly the last 4 years. Okay, so the tranquility of the nation would be destroyed. And some people are saying, oh man, nobody else has ever resigned from the presidency. That's a big enough gulp for Richard Nixon. Really, how much more blood do you want, or pound of flesh, or whatever? This is the kind of argument going. Therefore, with those arguments, this is what the pardon says. I, Gerald Ford, President of the United States, pursuant to the pardon power conferred upon me by Article 2, Section 2. Okay, so he actually tied this back to a constitutional thing. And it should have been done that way. It didn't need to be any other way, and it couldn't have been any other way. But anyway, so according to the power of the Constitution, I have granted, and by these presidents do grant, a full, free, absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon for all offenses against the United States which he, Richard Nixon, has committed or may have committed or taken part in during the period from January 20th, 1969 through August 9th, 1974. He was sworn in on that January 20th date, and he signed out on August 9th, 1974, totally covering his presidency. Okay, so it was controversial. There were a lot of people who were up in arms about this, and I scratched my head about it too. I got to ask you, I got to tell you. Critics said there was this bargain that had been cut, this bargain with the devil, if you will, between these men. Ford's pardon was granted if Nixon had resigned, but that made Ford president. So people are saying he took over the job because he had the power to say this guy gets away free, and this guy was willing to leave if he could get away free. Okay, so this is the kind of scuttlebutt that started going through. And again, now you think about the current press secretary for the president. Would she ever resign over a constitutional issue or over an integrity issue, or would she continue to lie through her teeth at every opportunity that came up? To mock and disparage anybody and everybody that wanted a real straight answer. I would submit that, in my opinion, is the thing that happened with Ford's press secretary. Ford's press secretary was a close personal friend of Gerald Ford, had been for years. Ford trusted him and wanted him to stand up there and present the material that was coming up. He resigned. He had enough integrity to say, this doesn't seem right to me. It smells bad. I'm out of here. He resigned, even though it was close personal friendship. Okay, so that's the kind of people we had 50 years ago. We don't today, sadly. So many people, and Ford himself, believed that he lost the 1976 election because of the pardon. And he lost it to Jimmy Carter. And then we can say elections have consequences, don't we? Jimmy Carter's bland presidency maybe never would have happened. A lot of the things that happened, remember some of the takeover of the American embassy in Iran and all that kind of stuff, 444 days sticks in my mind and all this kind of stuff. All of that kind of stuff, we wonder how much would have been avoided had Jimmy Carter not been installed in 1976. So you kind of see how at different hinge points, the nation takes different paths. It's very interesting to me, probably worthy of discussion at some time. New York Times, of course, not an icon of truth anymore, or maybe never was, but they wrote an editorial that said the pardon was profoundly unwise, divisive, or divisive, as some people say, an unjust act. Okay? And the pardon had destroyed Ford's credibility as a man of judgment, candor, and competence. So they say it ripped the rug from underneath our opinions about Ford. Okay. So this secret agreement concept that was being fostered actually brought Ford before the House Judiciary Committee. How much trouble would we have, and still haven't been able to get a president to sit before a House Judiciary Committee. But in October, just a month later, he's sitting in front of the House Judiciary Committee testifying. Okay. He was the first guy to do that since Abraham Lincoln. Okay. And his approval rating dropped from 71% to 50%, boom, overnight, with that pardon. People across the nation really thought it was kind of a bad deal. Many of them did anyway, at least half of them, because it dropped to 50%. Okay, so let's move on this idea of making treaties with the consent of 2/3 of the Senate. The president has the power to make treaties. He's kind of our chief diplomat, if you will. He brings treaties back to the nation and the Senate has to ratify them. Okay? He can't go sign a document and say, look at this, you guys. We've got a treaty now. We got to live by this or whatever. He can't do that. The Senate has to come back. Okay? Now you're going to see that people have taken the treaty-making power by misinterpretation and misapplication of Article 6 to mean that if you sign a treaty, it overrides the Constitution. We're going to review that now. Okay, so just like we have a president that claims he can go to war any dang time he wants, can't constitutionally. Just like we think that a treaty can change the Constitution any darn time they want, it can't. We'll discuss that at some length. So this misunderstanding, misconception, this lie that the Constitution can be modified by a treaty is destroying the nation right now. Okay, I'll give you an example or two. The Small Arms Treaty of the United Nations. Oh my goodness, it's going to take away our Second Amendment. I can't tell you how many emails I've gotten that says, oh, the Small Arms Treaty, it's going to take away our Second Amendment. Send me $20 and I'll make sure it doesn't happen. Whatever. If my $20 made that much difference, I would have been out of money a long time ago and we still wouldn't have had the problem solved, okay? But we get this kind of stuff all the time. Or the Treaty on the Rights of the Child is going to take over our families, or this Second Amendment thing with the Small Arms Treaty. It can't, it won't, and we'll explain that here over the next few minutes. So we're going to talk about these fundamental principles that we need to have as a baseline before we can understand why a treaty cannot change our Constitution. We'll do a brief review. Some people months ago went through this with us in a much greatly expanded viewpoint, but it needs to be reminded for even those that have been through it before. So principle one, we have to ask, where do we get our rights? Where do we get those things? You know, we claim these rights all the time. And by the way, I will say that God-given rights do not require you to fulfill mine, okay? A right created by government, or another artificial false right, if you will, creates an obligation of one person to fulfill that. So it takes away from one and gives to another. So if you create special standing before the law for a special class of people, which Utah did a few years ago with their housing and employment laws that they put out, they violated this concept. And they said, you as a landlord are going to lose rights on behalf of these people that now get new rights, okay? Or you as an employer loses these rights in favor of these people because of these special standing things. And by the way, churches generally, legislatures have discovered if we exclude a church or churches from having to obey this law, they'll support it. They'll come and testify on behalf of it. Yeah, they get their butts covered while everybody else gets thrown under the bus, okay? I've been at the legislature testifying against some of these things where church leadership is there testifying against me. Who has the more oomph? It ain't me, okay? So the legislature knows how to work this, and they do this oftentimes. But we need to understand the true source of our rights. So let's go back. We're going to use the Declaration of Independence on numerous occasions through this little process. Okay, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Okay, so God is the source of our rights, our Creator. Okay, so the next principle is, why is government? Okay, so we go back to the Declaration. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Okay, so we get our rights from God, and governments are there to make sure they get protected. That's their principal purpose for existence. Okay, they have to do other things they spend money on and stuff like that. They're far less important than preserving our God-given rights. Okay, so the purpose of government is to preserve God-given rights. Okay, so the principle three, the origin of authority to govern. Does somebody just come in and say, okay, you guys, I'm in charge? There's a lot of people that do that, okay? But that's not the authorized way to do it for proper government. Okay, so it's very clearly designed and stated in the Declaration of Independence. Governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. We mean us? We said it was okay and they can govern. Okay, that's it. Okay, so the consent of the governed is required. Well, we got to remember the consent of the governed comes through the ratification process. The constitutional ratification happens where the people say, just like Locke said earlier, we'll be governed by laws made by these people operating within the limits and bounds that are established within the Constitution. Okay, we ratify that. That's what happens. Okay, so the ratification process says that, okay, here are the rules, here are the limits and bounds. We will take trusted representatives, because we are a republic, and they will live within the bounds defined by the Constitution. The consent of the governed does not happen through the elective process. That's a big misconception. A lot of people think, let's say they're a legislator sitting in office right now today, legislating over our lives, liberties, and property, which they have very limited power to do. But the fact of the matter is, they don't have the power to do anything and everything they want. They're constrained. All the elective process does is say, we, the people, are going to select our trusted representatives to act within constitutional limits. That's really what happens in the elective process. We choose those representatives that will keep their actions within the proper bounds, and they take an oath to do that, by the way. So, principle 4, the authority to govern may be withdrawn. No, we're all in this to the death. Whatever. Okay. We'll go back to the Declaration again. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. This is a fact. So the people retain the right to alter or abolish it. By golly, those guys that wrote the Constitution in 1787, they remembered these things. We can change our government. How about that, sports fans? Okay. Article 5 says in the United States Constitution, we can do this peacefully. We don't have to go hang everybody, have a big revolutionary war, and kill everybody on the streets. We can do this in a peaceful manner. So here it says Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, so the House and the Senate, they propose amendments, 2/3 of them, and then they send them out for ratification to the states. 3/4 of the states have to ratify them in order for them to change the Constitution. Or 2/3 of the states can apply to Congress for a convention, and when they get 2/3 of the states, then Congress shall call a convention, okay? And anyway, when that comes out of either way, they say the legislature ratifies 3/4 of the states or by conventions. Just give you an example. Virtually all of them, I'll say, come to mind right now, all of the ratifications that have happened on these proposed amendments have gone through the legislatures, except the 21st Amendment. I'm going by memory, so I may be wrong, but let's look it up at some quick interval. But the 21st Amendment went to a convention in every state. Why? The 21st Amendment was to get rid of the prohibition of alcohol. A really crummy, stupid, idiotic thing to put in a constitution, by the way. You may be totally against alcohol. It may be the devil's drink. I don't know, whatever you want to call it. But you don't write that stuff in a constitution. Legislate against it, but don't put it in a constitution. They found that there was huge problems, and we don't need to go into all of those things because we're running out of time as it is. There were huge problems with this prohibition on alcohol. 18th Amendment did that. They put it in the Constitution. Federal government overreach, this going in and, Elliot Ness and breaking up the barrels of whiskey and all this kind of stuff. You remember the TV show, well, some of you don't. But at any rate, so they said, no, we got to get rid of the 21st Amendment. So Congress came up, 2/3 of the Congress said, we're going to get rid of this alcohol thing, Amendment 18. This is interesting since we're broadcasting from Utah. The general government said, we doubt the Utah legislature will approve this amendment. Let's do it in a convention. And then let's dink around with who gets put into as delegates to the convention. And they did. Utah ratified it also. It was the last state to ratify it, by the way. But the point of the matter is, there's a lot of points to it, I guess. One of which is, if they desire the ratification of an amendment by hook or crook, whether it's by stacking the deck in a convention, or if they pull shenanigans like that happened on the 14th Amendment. We'll talk about this at some length if we go through the amendment process. I'm not sure your patience will always be with us for that. But the amendment process of the 14th Amendment was absolutely tyranny on steroids, what they did to get that 14th Amendment through. The excommunicated states that had previously ratified the 13th Amendment says you guys can't vote on this. Other states that had voted to approve it removed it, and so they kind of got booted out too. It was an exercise in tyranny. 14th Amendment was a shenanigan top to bottom, but they got it ratified. That's what will happen when the establishment decides, by golly, by hook or by crook, we're going to get this thing established. Okay, so you read the Article 5 of the Constitution. Okay, and by the way, if they get a convention going, they can change the ratification process in the process of that. They did that with the first convention in 1787. They were called to revise, amend the existing Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. They went in. By the way, the Articles of Confederation required 100% of the states to authorize any changes. He said, by golly, we ain't going to get that. Rhode Island didn't even attend the convention, for crying out loud. How are we going to get every state? So they said, let's change it to 9 states, because there was 13 at the time. If you can change any of the Constitution, you can change all of it. And that's just what they did. They not only wrote a new Constitution, they changed the ratification process. Things to remember with the upcoming push for a Constitution Convention. Okay, so the lie is that the Constitution can be amended through the treaty process. Did you see anything in Article 5 that says treaties can modify the Constitution? By golly, you didn't. How about that, sports fans? Okay, so people say, no. Article 6 says the Constitution and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. Well, see, treaties are going to supersede, okay? But I underlined all of that part because I wanted to read that to you. But under the authority of the United States, where does the authority of the United States come from? The Constitution. Okay, well, okay, I know where you're going with your comment, because we the people and all that kind of stuff, the idea of the states and the ratification of the states, all that kind of stuff happened. But the Constitution does not have any authority in it for them to change the Constitution by the treaty. That is, the authority of the United States is the Constitution. That's the limits and bounds of it, okay? Well, let's go back and look at the treaty power of the president. He, the president, shall have power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. Well, see, they can write treaties and then the senators, 2/3 of the Senate, so you got to have 67 senators to say, okay, guys, this treaty is a good one, even if it's a bad one, which they did with NATO and United Nations and CETO and all these other ones that we pointed out are disasterized. Now, by the way, they know that they can't usually get that kind of level of ratification, so they're calling them agreements. And when the USMCA or NATO, not NATO, what do they call it? NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement. They only voted for a rare majority. They're not really treaties, but they pull these shenanigans because they can no longer, they know, get these 67 votes of the senators. So they vote with a regular majority. That's another discussion someday. Okay, so again, we're going to go back that when 2/3 of both houses agree and 3/4 of the states agree, that's how we get a constitution change. Congress can't change it. No legislative enactment can change that. No majority, no matter how many there are, if we've got 100 senators and 435 congressmen that say, we're changing the Constitution, it ain't going to happen because it's got to go out and be ratified by the states. So the people have a way and a say to get in the way of that. And if you look at this, none of the ratification processes for treaties require more than a presidential agreement and 2/3 majority of Senate, okay? Can't be done, okay, because the people will be left out. Let's go back to the Declaration of Independence. It's the right of the people to alter or abolish their government. People would be left out of any constitutional modification if it were allowed to occur solely the president saying and 2/3 of the Senate agreeing. It violates this stuff of the people altering or abolishing. This is a critical, important thing. We're going to go back and, oh man, I wish there was time to read the whole farewell address of George Washington. Time flees, though. Washington picked up on this thing that was found in the Declaration and in the Constitution. He says it's the right of the people to make and to alter their constitutions. It is. It's written in. But the Constitution, which at any time exists until changed by an explicit and authentic act of the whole people, is sacredly obligatory upon all. We all, especially those that hold office, take an oath that says, yep, we're going to abide by the Constitution. If, in the opinion of the people, the distribution or modification of the constitutional powers be in any particular wrong, I underlined, I italicized, I bolded, wrong. Because everybody that wants to change the Constitution says, oh my goodness, they're violating the Constitution, and so we've got to change it. No, wait a minute. That doesn't mean the Constitution is wrong. It means the people who got in office are wrong, okay? And so the people that say that are violating logic, reason, and intelligence. The wrongness is not in the Constitution. The wrongness is in whoever's doing it, whether it's a court or a legislative body or a president, whomever it is, okay? Okay, if it's wrong, let it be corrected by an amendment in the way which the Constitution designates, But let there be no change by usurpation, for though this in one instance may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. And we are destroying our government by allowing this usurpation to happen. President makes an executive order, it's wrong, can't be done. Takes us to war, wrong, can't be done. Okay, the Constitution is not wrong, it's the people that are doing it. Okay, here's Tucker again. He said, he just wanted to see about treaties. Let it be supposed, for example, that the President and Senate should stipulate by treaty. So we had a President sign one, bring it back, Senate ratified it, with any foreign nation that in case of war, NATO or CETO or United Nations, I mean, you can think of a few that we've blown. In case of war between that nation and any other, the United States should immediately declare against that nation. Can it be supposed that such a treaty would be so far the law of the land as to take from the House of Representatives their constitutional right to deliberate on the expediency or inexpediency of such a declaration of war and to determine and act thereon according to their own judgment? So he's saying, this is stupid. To think that a treaty could do that is wrong. Tucker's a pretty bright guy. We don't have very many bright guys in House and Senate and executive anymore, by the way. Okay, so Thomas Jefferson said, by the general power to make treaties, the Constitution must have intended to comprehend only those objects which are usually regulated by treaty and cannot otherwise be regulated. It must have meant to accept out of these the rights reserved to the states, for surely the President and Senate cannot do by treaty what the whole government is interdicted from doing in any way. These guys were pretty bright guys. Okay, going on. He said, our peculiar security is that the possession of a written constitution. It's a written contract. Tucker said that, by the way. Let us not make it a blank paper by construction. So we're going to hold our mouth a certain way and say, this is what it really meant. No, plain English words, we can know what those words mean. I say the same as to the opinion of those who consider the grant of treaty-making power as boundless. If it is, then we have no constitution. This is logic, reason, and intelligence. If it has bounds, there can be no others than the definitions of power which that instrument gives. It specifies and delineates the operations permitted to the federal government and gives all the powers necessary to carry these into operation, execution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, You'll hear that clause here in a little while, a Supreme Court decision. Madison wrote, again, the father of the Constitution, does it follow because this power, treaty power, is given to Congress? He was talking about treaties. It didn't say it right there. When I put it in brackets, it means I've inserted what was inferred from the previous statement. It is given to Congress that it is absolute and unlimited. I do not conceive that power is given to the President and Senate to dismember the empire or to alienate any great essential right. I do not think the whole legislative authority have this power. The exercise of the power must be consistent with the object of the delegation. So they gave him treaty power to do the things that were necessary to have treaties with other nations, not take away constitutional power or God-given rights or anything like that. Okay, let's look at a 67-year-old Supreme Court decision. 1957, predates most in the room. They call it Reed v. Covert. Go get it. I wish there were time to read the entire Reed v. Covert decision because it was monumental. This is one of the things Chief Justice and his court did right. You can see the Chief Justice and those that are there. Okay, so these people made this decision. It's a kind of a weird thing. It happened in the October term of 1955. They start their term in October. And they heard the argument in May of 1956. They decided in June of 1956, they made the wrong decision. They said, an agreement or treaty takes precedence over the Constitution. Holy Hannah, we can't do that. They started thinking about it. They went to this guy. His name was Fritz Wiener. You'll see his name in just a minute. He was the one that had argued before the Supreme Court about this. And they said, please, 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 petition for a rehearing. Bring it back before us. We want to look at this one again. So they had a rehearing in November of 1956. Took a few months to get it back in there. They re-argued it in February of 57, and they decided it in June of 57 and overturned themselves. That pesky Supreme Court makes bad decisions sometimes, but they fixed this one, okay, which is really, really there were people that had minds in those days instead of mush for brains that we've got today, but holy cow, this was unprecedented. This is legal history. This guy, Fritz Wiener, was the guy that argued it. It's the only time a lawyer lost in the Supreme Court and won in a rehearing. It's the only time in all the history of the Supreme Court. And they invited him back. Please come back and re-argue this. We screwed up. Okay. So it was a landmark decision. The court ruled, and this is, the Constitution supersedes international treaties ratified by the United States Senate. And all agreements, regardless who makes them. And we're going to see in just a minute that this was initially done based upon a bad executive agreement that had happened. Basically, in the executive agreement, they used the Article 1, Section 8 power of Congress to set up, the court rules for military. And they had, by extension, given them over civilians that were members of the family of military that were overseas. So this woman got convicted on a military tribunal. And the court really, oh man, we can't do that. That violates the Constitution. You can't have civilians tried before a military tribunal unless you're some kind of radical Republican group that's right after the Civil War and they do all sorts of egregious things to deconstruct the South, but that's another discussion. So this was appealed to the Supreme Court saying, no, this woman, this spouse, a U.S. citizen, not a member of the military, was tried by a military tribunal, and we don't think that's right. So that was the argument, okay? So it was an executive agreement, not a treaty in the legal sense of the terms. But after they ruled on this woman's case, they then expanded their ruling to include anything, including the United States treaties that are made. So you can't make a treaty that's going to override the Constitution. You'll see that. What you'll see is I put quotation marks. This is all I had time for, and I probably don't have time for all of these. But you're going to be reading through this thing saying, holy cow, the Supreme Court actually said this? Man, they were cogent. Yeah, I believe these guys. Okay, so whenever you see quotation marks around a statement, this came directly out of the Reed v. Covert decision. No agreement. So again, remember, this was an executive agreement to begin with, and then they expanded it to treaties. But no agreements, all encompassing when they finally get done with this. Where the foreign nation can confer on Congress or any other branch of the government power which is free from restraints of the Constitution. I could probably end right now and say that's the way it is, boys and girls. We're going to go on because they said it so many ways in so many great, wonderful ways. When the United States acts against its citizens abroad, it can do so only in accordance with all the limitations imposed by the Constitution, including Article 3, Section 2, and the 5th and 6th Amendments. We'll look at these when we get into Article 3, and we'll look at these when we get into the Bill of Rights. Going on, though, the powers of Congress under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 14 of the Constitution, and it quotes those clauses in there, we looked at them earlier, to make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces, taken in conjunction with the necessary and proper clause, that's Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, does not extend to civilians, even though they may be dependents living with the servicemen on a military base. Okay? This is where they're deciding this woman's case. And then they're going to expand it so that everybody here should be able to say, woo-woo. Okay. It wasn't just her conviction that they were throwing out. It's any effort by the U.S. government to use any agreement or treaty to destroy U.S. citizens' rights. Okay. Going on. Under our Constitution, courts of law alone are given power to try civilians for their offenses against the United States. We reject the idea that when the United States acts against citizens abroad, it can do so free of the Bill of Rights. Have we ever seen something like this happen since 9/11/2001? Yes, we have. I wish there were time to review the cases where individuals were bereft of all of their constitutional rights. Citizens of the United States, but that's a George W. Bush issue. Anyway, so going on. The United States is entirely a creature of the Constitution. The country got actually created under the constitutional umbrella. It doesn't exist without the Constitution, okay? Its power and authority have no other source. It didn't say, well, by golly, we made our own up. No, they do it all the time now, which is unconstitutional, but no. The Constitution delegates the specific authority allowed for the United States government to exist, and it can't create its own out of thin, whole cloth, whatever you want to call it, thin air. It can only act in accordance with all the limitations imposed by the Constitution. When the government reaches out to punish the citizen who is abroad, the shield which the Bill of Rights and other parts of the Constitution provide to protect his life and liberty should not be stripped away just because he happens to be in another land. Cool, man. When you go to France and the U.S. government gets involved, they can't forget your Bill of Rights. Okay. I don't want to talk about Assange right now, but anyway, you guys have got to take up some of these points. There was a professor at BYU that when he'd make these little undertone things, you better go research it. It was going to be on the next class quiz, I guarantee. I guarantee. That was when BYU had some professors that were worth having. Okay, going on. This court and other federal courts have held or asserted that various constitutional limitations apply to the government when it acts outside the continental United States, while it has been suggested that only those constitutional rights which are fundamental protect Americans abroad. Okay, they're saying there's some fundamental principles that you got to live by, but we can throw some of them out. Okay, they're going to find against that position. They go on to say, we can find no warrant in logic or otherwise for picking and choosing among the remarkable collection of thou shalt nots, which were explicitly fastened on all departments and agencies of the federal government by the Constitution and its amendments. So they're saying there's a whole bunch of things in here that you're precluded from doing, and there's no way you can overlook any of those. Okay, going on. Moreover, in view of our heritage and the history of the adoption of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, it seems peculiarly anomalous to say that a trial before a civilian judge and by an independent jury picked from the common citizenry is not a fundamental right. So these basic things, all included. You can't say, oh, that one doesn't count. Only these three here do, or whatever. They're all still there. At the time of Mrs. Covert's alleged offense, an executive agreement, remember this is an executive agreement with England, was in effect with the United States and Great Britain, which permitted the United States military courts to exercise exclusive jurisdiction over offenses committed in Great Britain by American servicemen or their dependents. Au contraire, my fair friend. The obvious and decisive answer to this, of course, is that no agreement with a foreign nation can confer power on the Congress or any other branch of government which is free from the restraints of the Constitution. Okay. Then it goes on to quote. Everything's still in quotes here. They quoted the Article 6 out of the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution, saying, this Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made, or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. They went back and they actually said, this is what it says in the Constitution. And then they said this, there is nothing in this language which intimates that treaties and laws enacted pursuant to them do not have to comply with the provisions of the Constitution. Nor is it, so this small arms treaty that they keep trying to say is going to take away our Second Amendment, no, it can't. It cannot. The Treaty of the Rights of the Child cannot take away our American process of being parents. Okay, so anyway, do not have to comply with the provisions of the Constitution, nor is there anything in the debates which accompanied the drafting and ratification of the Constitution which even suggests such a result. It would be manifestly contrary to the objectives of those who created the Constitution, as well as those who were responsible for the Bill of Rights, let alone alien to our entire constitutional history and tradition, to construe Article 6, this Supremacy Clause thing, as permitting the United States to exercise power under an international agreement without observing constitutional prohibitions. Man, this was a great decision. They saw how badly they screwed up, and they says, we're going to correct this, baby. Okay. Quoting still, in effect, such construction would permit amendment of that document in a manner not sanctioned by Article 5. They were right. Article 5 says nothing about this agreement nonsense. Okay, the prohibitions of the Constitution were designed to apply to all branches of the national government, and they cannot be nullified by the executive or by the executive and the Senate combined. You bring me back a treaty that violates the Constitution, it can't violate our constitutional rights. Then they cite a previous Supreme Court decision. And so you'll see here, there's triple quotes before and triple quotes after, meaning this is still in the body. What they said in the body is a quotation directly out of that previous Supreme Court decision. So they're reinforcing the position they take. The treaty power, as expressed in the Constitution, is in terms unlimited except by those restraints which are found in that instrument against the action of the government or its departments, and those arising from the nature of the government itself and of that of the states. It would not be contended that it extends so far as to authorize what the Constitution forbids, or a change in the character of the government or in that of one of the states, or a cessation of any portion of the territory of the latter without its consent. So they're saying in this previous decision, you can't mess with the Constitution in anything that comes up, treaty or otherwise. Going on, quotation, there is nothing new or unique about what we say here. This court has regularly and uniformly recognized the supremacy of the Constitution over a treaty. Period, end of quote. Okay. Because of this nonsense, remember what year this was redecided? 1957. Who was president? Eisenhower. Okay. You're going to find that Eisenhower and the Secretary of State were the principal opposition to the position stated by the decision. Okay. But Eisenhower was a good Republican president. I like Ike. Everybody, so on. Yeah, right. Blah, blah, blah. His membership in the Council on Foreign Relations, his efforts as a globalist, all that kind of stuff should be well known to all of us. But there was a senator named John W. Bricker that during that period of time, Eisenhower came in 53, was sworn in. Beginning though in 51, Bricker proposed several amendments which he said would clarify this thing that the globalists were attempting to foist on the United States. Why? What was going on then? This thing called the Korean War. What did Truman do? I don't need a declaration of war. I've got this treaty that we signed with the United Nations, and therefore we go to war on my direction because the United Nations said. That's in essence what happened, what Truman said. So Bricker in 51 started saying, let's clarify that treaty-making stuff and clarify why this isn't the way it is. Here's a little review of his biography. He was a senator. He was governor of Ohio. He was a Republican nominee for vice president in 1944. He was a well-known political figure in that era. Okay, I've gone through, and every year that he proposed Bricker amendments, he had to modify them a little bit, hold his mouth a little bit differently in the hopes that it would get through the ratification process. Okay, so this is the best Bricker amendment I found, but there were several attempts. There wasn't a need for it, but he was trying to clarify so that somebody couldn't pull the wool over our eyes at some point. This is what he proposed. A provision of a treaty or other international agreement which conflicts with this Constitution or which is not made in pursuance thereof shall not be the supreme law of the land, nor be of any force or effect. He figured that had shut down this discussion that Truman had really opened the can of worms on. So this 1954 version of the amendment failed to get the two-thirds requirement in the House and the Senate. They couldn't even get it through the House and Senate, let alone sending it out to the states. So they couldn't get it in as an amendment. Over the next few years, he diluted and polluted and put them forth just to kind of appease his critics and gain approval. All of them attempts failed, every one of them, okay? Who were the primary opposition? Dwight D. Eisenhower, the globalist that was seeking to implement, stuff the CFR was looking for, Council on Foreign Relations, and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. By the way, John Foster Dulles' brother was director of the CIA, okay? He was the guy that planned the Bay of Pigs. He was the guy that Kennedy fired. He was the guy that was put in charge of the Warren Commission review of the Kennedy assassination. These Dulles guys were embedded in every stinking mess that came along in all their years of being around, okay? So, who is John Foster? Okay, some of you may remember Edward Mandell House. You don't remember him, he died before you were born. But he was the guy that wrote Philip Drew Administrator. He was the guy that talked about overthrowing the Constitution with a benign West Point graduate that was going to implement an oligarchy that was going to serve us better. He was a globalist. Woodrow Wilson, tapped him to lead a delegation in 1916, before we, the United States, entered World War I, to go write a treaty. It ended up being the Versailles Treaty, with a League of Nations Incorporated. The League of Nations' intent was to overthrow the United States Constitution. Anybody that ratified the League of Nations said, we're going to go under the United Nations. Well, it was, okay, let me back up, rewind. Anybody that ratified the Versailles Treaty to end World War I would automatically ratify the League of Nations Treaty, which would subvert that nation into a global government called the League of Nations. Okay, it was the precursor of the United Nations. House and a team went to Europe in 1916. The United States wasn't even involved in the war at the time. In 1918, Woodrow Wilson, appointed him legal counsel to the United States Versailles Treaty delegation. Throughout 1934, he was a supporter of Hitler. He was presidential candidate for presidential candidate Thomas Dewey got his foreign policy from this guy named John Foster Dulles. He drafted the preamble to the United Nations. He was a U.S. UN delegate in 1946, 47, and 1950. So this guy was right there writing the global governance stuff that was supposed to subvert the United States Constitution. He was appointed a U.S. Senator. He was Secretary of State to Eisenhower, and he formulated the NATO and CETO treaties that we went to war under and have continued to go to war under, at least the NATO treaties. Okay, this guy was there in the center of all of these entangling alliances and everything else the Founding Fathers warned us against. So you can see how Eisenhower and Dulles were very much against this Bricker, correction of misunderstanding. We just need to understand you can't modify the Constitution by amendment process or a treaty process. I mean, you can modify it by amendment, but not by treaty. Okay, and the amendment process is as defined in the Article 5. Okay, so the presidential has power to make treaties with 2/3 of the Senate and to nominate ambassadors, other high officials, Supreme Court justice, and other officers with Senate approval. So this is basically the duties of the president. Well, we're going to cover a few in a little bit. He has to report the State of the Union to Congress. This was given initially as addresses to Congress. Once Jefferson came in, he didn't speak well, he didn't have a strong voice, and he turned his report in written form. Okay, and so it doesn't specify the president's got to get up and do the cheerleader process that happens with our State of the Union address, and the pep rally and everything else that comes out of that. You got to report the State of the Union, and Jefferson started turning them in. Wilson took up the idea of a speech, and it's usually mostly continued. Okay, so there is a requirement that the president take care that the laws be faithfully executed. The United States, let's just take one example and why this is an impeachable thing. He's violating his constitutional oath. The United States Congress, according to Article 1, Section 8, create immigration law. They created the most liberal immigration laws in the world. And they have something that some people think, violates God's law. They say, God doesn't have boundaries. Or immigration law. Yeah, he does. He really does. Except a man be born of the water and of the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. Okay, there's two rules anyway. Getting baptized in water and Spirit, you can't enter the kingdom of God. And no unclean thing can enter the kingdom of God. Well, wait, unclean things. There's a lot of commandments. Okay. People that say these kinds of things are filled with nonsense. But anyway, the United States has followed this process that the law dictates who can come in our country. Open violation of that, unequivocal violation of that, that alone is an impeachable offense. Okay, so we need to remember that the laws need to be faithfully executed. But we're going to absolutely, for a few minutes here, talk about the president has absolutely no power to create law. None whatsoever, zero. Okay, so again, going back to Tucker, the part assigned to him, the president, by the Constitution is strictly preventative and not creative. He cannot create law. Okay, all legislative authority is held by the legislature, Article 1, Section 1. All legislative authority herein granted is held by the House and the Senate. Okay. Well, I've got a quotation here. Herein granted shall be vested in the Congress of the United States, which consists of the House and the Senate. Okay. Okay, so Article 1, Section 7 defines how laws are made. And it says specifically in here, and we're going to read the part before that in just a moment, not read it, but we'll review the germane points in the interest of time, not read the whole document. So here's Article 1, Section 7, Clause 2 of the United States Constitution. Every bill shall have passed the House of Representatives and the Senate shall therefore, before it become a law, be presented to the President of the United States. If he approves, he shall sign it. But if not, he shall return it with his objections to that House in which it shall have originated, who shall enter the objections at large on their journal and proceed to reconsider it. If after such reconsideration 2/3 of that House shall agree to pass the bill, it shall be sent together with the objections to the other House, by which it shall likewise be reconsidered, and if approved by 2/3 of that House, it shall become law. Because if the President vetoes a law, it goes back to the House and the Senate. If it comes out with a 2/3 majority, it's a law over his veto, okay? Then let's look at what it says in Article 1, Section 7. All bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives. So we violate this horribly. We have with Obamacare and with this recent effort for the Senate to begin funding other nations in their efforts at war. Okay, all this foreign aid nonsense has originated in the Senate lately. That's not according to the Constitution. It's got to originate in the House. The Senate can propose or concur on those amendments, as in with other bills. Every bill passed the House and the Senate shall, before it becomes a law, be presented to the President of the United States. If he approves it, he signs. If not, he returns it, and those objections to the House which originated in, and the House shall reconsider it. After 2/3 of that House agree to pass the bill, it shall be sent with the objections over to the other House, and if they approve, it shall become law. If any bill shall not be returned by the President within 10 days, Sundays excepted, he gets the Sabbath off, after it shall have been presented to him, the same shall be law. So if he doesn't do anything with it, it's as though he signed it. Okay, unless Congress has adjourned in the interim and it prevents its return, then it is not be a law if he hasn't signed it. Okay. That's right out of Article 1, Section 7. That's very clear. There's no allowance for a partial acceptance. A lot of presidents, when they sign a bill, says, well, I'm going to enforce blah, 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 these different clauses in the bill, but these we're going to let them slide. Okay? Can't do it. It's an all or nothing kind of thing. Okay, so Ronald Reagan, communicator that he was, oftentimes would get up and roar to his audiences that cheered him on, give me the line item veto. We'll talk about that just very briefly. We're running out of time. If that happened, the president would become a super legislature. Let's just take a very simple, straightforward kind of thing. Let's say the House and Senate passed a bill that had so many billions of dollars in it for defense and so many billions of dollars in it for social programs. Okay. If the president had line item veto, he could cross out all the defense things, say, this is the bill we got. He'd be a super legislator. He crossed out the defense stuff and he kept the social program, or vice versa, whoever's doing it, okay? Fact of the matter is, he would override the House and the Senate's will of the people, which formerly were the people and the states. You do it all, you don't do any. If you don't like it, veto it. Send it back, tell them why. If they pass it by 2/3, it still isn't law, okay? Within the constraints of the Constitution, okay? Those limits and bounds have always got to apply. Tucker, again, he can't create law. The part assigned to him, the president, by the Constitution is strictly preventative and not creative. Okay, so these signing statements, and they claim they can say, oh, I'm going to take the first few clauses, I'm going to not really look at this one, I'll take these next clauses. Can't do that. It's all or nothing. And line item veto, if ever granted, would be horrible because the president would become a supra-legislator. So we got to prevent anything that becomes some kind of veto power, line item veto power. He has veto power, all or nothing, and he's got to use it the way it is. Jefferson said, in questions of power then, let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down for mischief by the change of the Constitution. And Madison said, the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. So if the president took over the legislative powers, he's really getting pretty close to tyranny. Okay, now we're coming close to the end. When a president or vice president and all the civil officers get impeached and convicted of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, they're to be removed from office. High crimes, think of felonies. Misdemeanors, think of, these misdemeanors, misdemeanor offense. Okay, they got to rise to a certain level. There have been people removed from office, judges, for example, for drunkenness on the bench and for lewd comments to women. I mean, this is a pretty broad thing that you can say, oh, wait, you've crossed the line. You're out of here, baby. Okay. So that's what impeachment is for, treason, bribery, other high crimes and misdemeanor. When we do the third article, we're going to talk about treason and how carefully it's defined by the Constitution, and for good reason. There's a lot of powers that the president has, but this is a kind of a summary of them. He's the head of state for the nation, the military commander-in-chief, the CEO of the executive branch, foreign diplomat, chief foreign diplomat for the nation. He advocates for legislation, can't create it. He grants pardons and reprieves when justice demands it, but is excluded from that when there's an impeachment. They're enumerated as we presented him here. He possesses no other constitutional powers, none, not one. But in spite of what the Constitution says, this has been added to the president's power list, okay? So he's responsible for full employment of the nation, the agricultural programs, the housing programs, the atomic energy program. This is all redelegated by the Congress, mind you. Stuff about private loans and insurance, natural disasters, national welfare, Medicare and Medicaid, and making sure these things stay active. The Social Security program, he oversees that. Educational funds, hundreds of billions of dollars. Labor and management disputes, health agencies, health and human services, you've heard of that. Environmental protection agencies and those that are in his administration of those things. Federal lands and resources. Energy resources and their discovery. Several major industries are overseen by the president. Radio and TV license, think of the FCC. Okay, food and drug resources. Oh man, we went through a real nightmare on that for a few years, didn't we? Regional programs that previously the states did. All of these things have been heaped on the president, no constitutional authority. You can't find any justification for any of this, whether it's the FDA, the EPA, the OSHA, the NIOSH, whether it's Transportation Security Agency, the FCC, the FAA. You mentioned the BATFE, the IRS, all these alphabet soup organizations that are in the executive branch. There is no constitutional authority for any one of them. If we need one, we need to amend the Constitution, but you can't just by usurpation take it over. So we've kept it within the limits and bounds that were set for us time-wise, and we just will mention what next time we're going to talk about when we get together. We're going to talk about Article 3, the judicial job description, the Supreme Court itself, the inferior courts, the term of office, original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, how they have appellate jurisdiction constitutionally, how that may be limited, by the way, jury trial and how it's protected, and that was protected by other amendments afterwards. Jefferson and many others thought that in spite of the fact jury trial gets protected in Article 3, it needed to have expanded protection, and so we get some amendments like the Fifth Amendment, the Sixth Amendment, the Seventh Amendment. Yeah, they threw a third, basically, of the Bill of Rights into this protection of the jury and other jurisdiction of the judicial, and then matters of treason. That's what we're going to talk about next time. And so we have just a couple minutes. Do you want to have questions, or do you want to bring it to a close quickly, or what would you like?
We have till 6 in the morning.
Yeah. Well, they're broadcasting to numerous, sources or destinations that probably are not going to remain online. But No. Check, check, check. Do you want to come and use mine?
Check. Okay,
Oh.
I'll just use this one. So yeah, let's definitely do question and answer. If anyone has questions, I'm going to hand you this microphone so that we have a lot of people online that want to hear the question before Scott answers. So
Or attempts to give an answer.
I was just thinking about the 17th Amendment that I think we can all agree basically sidelined the states from a lot of things. Can Congress create, or any part of the Article 5 process, create something that is binding, that is unconstitutional? Because in Section 2, I think paragraph 5, it talks about how the place of the choosing of senators cannot be changed by Congress, that the date or time or manner
couldn't.
of could. So how did Congress pass an amendment that changed a part
changed
of
the
something that they
Constitution.
didn't have? And
See,
is
the
that
Congress couldn't say, oh, you guys can do everything, including changing how we do senators. That was completely, specifically excluded. And so they were prevented by that statement from doing just what has been done by the 17th Amendment. The 17th Amendment was an egregious violation of this delicate separation of not only sources of power, but power itself. So the states were the source of power for the senators. And that's why they said, you can't change that. It took a change of the Constitution to change that. Congress didn't change it. They recommended the change and the states ratified it. And that's how we got in this mess right now.
Did they specifically carve out the place of the choosing of U.S. senators, though, in that amendment?
What they did is they said they will be chosen at large by the people. So the people choose the senators. 17th Amendment says that. Senators have become glorified representatives. They got 6 years instead of just 2. Why did the congressmen get 2? Because they're the most powerful office in the nation. They have the voice of the people. That's a pretty big voice. And they have the power of the purse. Article 1, Section 7 says, originate the money bills there. Senate can amend later, but with the power of the purse and the voice of the people, man, they're a big force. So they only gave them 2 years. Hey, you guys get out of line, we're going to boot you. We don't anymore, but that's rare. But the senators now have become, for 6 years, these guys hold the office and they become basically a tyranny because they've got the voice of the people behind them now. So they said the senators will be chosen at large within the states. But it was in violation of what the original intent was. As you point out, they're saying, no, we can't change the way they are. Yeah, we can if we change the Constitution. Another point to your point. Does that make sense? Anyway, here's the deal. Well, you could give it back to him, but let me just jabber on for a minute or two. Those that want to change our Constitution, that want to call a convention, okay, they say, oh, no. It already says 3/4 of the states got to ratify. They'd never, all the bamboozling in the world couldn't get them to do that. Oh, yeah? Does anybody remember the 14th Amendment? By hook and crook, they got that amendment through and ratified. The 16th Amendment? Yeah. This IRS thing that they're using that as 17th Amendment? Yeah. 18th Amendment? Yeah. I mean, we started, and that was 100 years ago plus. They had a far better understanding of constitutional limits and powers 100 years ago than we do now. And yet they still, 3/4 of the states ratified stupid amendments. And we're still suffering under some of them. They got rid of the 18th one. They saw that stupidity fairly soon, but they still had to do that. But these people that say, if we have a convention, we can't change, nobody can change the ratification process. Oh, the Articles of Confederation had a 100% of all states had to ratify any change before it could be changed. The guys that rewrote the Constitution said, nope, we only have to have 9 out of 13. They could change it to a 51%, let's say, so 51 states had to ratify, or a majority of Congress, or a majority of those that called in on a 900 number, or a majority of those that came in and dipped their finger on purple ink like they did the Iraqi Constitution. It could be done any number of ways, which would all be a disaster, because in today's world, the knowledge of and understanding of constitutional processes and the limits and bounds and the constraints that are there and why they're there would be overlooked completely. And so we have to be very careful about how we do this. And they will get it ratified if they want to. They did it with the 17th, as you point out, like, holy cow, how did that happen? It did. And they had a lot better understanding than we do. We should change that, but we don't need to call a convention to get rid of the 17th Amendment or the 16th Amendment. We just do it like they did the 18th Amendment. A single purpose 21st Amendment that says, this is a bad, stupid thing. 2/3 of the House and Senate, send it out, 3/4 of the states, we won't lose the whole Constitution then. So that's kind of where it is. And yeah, they had to amend the Constitution in order to do it because the legislature couldn't make that call. Good question. So who else? Yes, sir.
You
man, I'm
opened
gonna-
with the job description of the presidency. Related to today, the insanity plea is essentially the president or a person is incompetent to stand trial. So the president was just turned incompetent to stand trial, yet is the description of the presidency so simple that someone incompetent could hold that office?
There's a 25th Amendment. You might get that out and take a look at that. That says if the president is adjudged in any way not capable of doing his job, there's a process by which that can be done to get rid of the president. Okay? There can be a short-term handover of power that's got back, or the long-term effect. And there's people today, and I think you're referring to the recent decision that, oh, by golly, this poor old, frail, doddering old man, he just made a few goof ups, and so we're not going to convict him or charge him with these classified documents that he brought home in a cardboard box, put out with his Corvette, or spread around to universities and handed them out to different people. No, we're not going to do that. We're not going to charge him with anything. But they did have implicit in that the guy's not competent to be the job and to do the job. Okay, so some people are going, yeah, we can get rid of him under the 25th Amendment. Who's in back of him? Spiro Agnew. Oh, no. It's Camilla. No. No, I'm telling you, who's in back of him? Or her, I should say. It's Mike Johnson. A guy that's really screwed up so far many of the things that because of his misplaced, shall we say, loyalties. You know, who's in back of him? The President Pro Tem. Oh, that's got to be a good one. Chuck Schumer. We are in deep doo-doo, folks. And the 25th Amendment is a way to take people out that are incompetent. But we have put ourselves in such a bucket of hurt as the people of this nation that it's almost, there's a lot of people that are saying we're at a very fragile point. We're at a hinge point. And so the problems that we have are not easily resolved. Elections have consequences. We've got to quit electing buffoons, baboons, and fools to our assigned trusted representatives. We've got to insist that they keep their oath of office. And unless and until we get enough friends that understand these things, we're going to continue to be at high risk. And it's not an easy solution. It took us years to get into this. It's going to take us probably years to get out if we've got that much time. Our nation is failing faster than we would hope, though, for sure. So the 25th Amendment, go read it again about how they get rid of it. Yes.
There shall be no titles of entitlement, and yet the Speaker of the House is a super legislator,
Yeah.
which takes away equal representation of all the other, the President of the Senate, same, Chairman of committees. They exercise inordinate powers to control the way the other representatives vote. For them to have such power, and such power, I submit, is titles of nobility. We have unelected agencies. It defies equal representation. The president can't create law, but he tells the agencies what to do.
In violation of the Constitution,
Right.
we must admit.
Executive orders, as if the executive could order me to do something. I'm not an employee. I'm not a member of his cabinet. Executive orders, in my thinking, is the cabinet works for him. He could tell the cabinet what to do. The 17th Amendment senators, they're super legislators. That defies no titles of nobility.
Okay, you bring up probably 15 different things. Each one would take 20 minutes. But let me say this about that. No, it's absolutely well, let's first look at these. Let's look at the House Ways and Means Committee, the Speaker of the House. Please look at the Judiciary Committee chair. All these kind of things. As you point out, these guys got lots of power. Okay, but let's look at Article 1, Section 5, where in Clause 2 it says each House may determine the rules of its proceedings, punish its members for disorderly behavior, and with the concurrence of 2/3, expel a member. Okay, so what we need to do is we need to elect those trusted representatives that are determined to take away these hotty-dotty kind of positions you're talking about, okay? That is absolutely a requirement. All these others you mentioned, whether it's any agency, they don't have lawmaking authority. They simply do not. All legislative authority herein granted is with House and Senate, right? All legislative authority. There's no way for the House or the Senate to delegate that. They may say, oh, by golly, we got these guys that we don't understand guns. If they're black and they look scary, they must be bad. This is kind of their mentality. Let's turn it over to the BATFE and let them make the regulations. They can't. They say, well, their regulations or policies or, any of those foolish names, and Rose by any other name is still a rose, right? So if they're creating something that looks like a law, acts like a law, quacks like a duck, acts like a duck, whatever, walks like a duck, the saying, it's a duck. So they're creating laws that are enacted within their agency, a federal agency, and those laws are enforced upon Americans, all unconstitutionally. And unless and until we get enough people that understand this, we have people in the House and the Senate that are going to continue to delegate this authority. They need to rein it in. How can they do that? Immediately, Article 1, Section 7 says they withdraw money. Article 1, Section 9 says if we don't pass funding for this, the IRS agents are going to go home, let's say, okay, if they can't get money. Executive orders. George Washington issued executive orders. But they were to, say, Thomas Jefferson, his Secretary of State, say, Tom, I'd like a report on how much trade we did with England last year. Thomas Jefferson went away and came back and wrote it. That was an order to Thomas Jefferson. You're absolutely correct. They cannot be passed on another person. A president cannot create law that's enforced against Americans. All of these are abject testimonies of how far we've strayed. You bring up so many things that if Americans understood how we are losing our liberty, it'd be hard, we'd be hard constrained to not have a revolution. I don't want a revolution. I want us to rein this back in and say, this is the basis of our liberty. We will not allow our representatives to abrogate their responsibility to legislate within the bounds. Stop the president from doing that. Stop all executive branch organizations by all of the alphabet soup names from creating law that's enforced upon Americans. Oh, but it's not law, they say to me. Yeah, it's enforced as though it were law. And whatever they're calling it, it's still that in effect. So that's why we need more friends. We need more people that can say, I understand this. People that are in the listening audience, people that are in this audience, people that, I give speeches all over. I've just been out of state speaking. And the fact of the matter is we're making an outcry for friends to come and do this the right way. And what you've pointed out, every single one of them is a stinking disaster. So thank you. Let's listen to it.
And just having the understanding of what the problem is important before you can even talk about the solution. So identifying the problem, most people can't even explain what you just said, right? Well, look what they're doing and here's why it's illegal, right? So this is the foundation that we have to have first. But do we want to have one more question for Scott from anyone? Okay. And then I'm gonna, okay, you did have a question? Okay, we'll do one more question and then and then I'll talk to you guys for a minute.
I noticed that every bureaucracy is all corporations. The legislature is even a corporation. The state is a corporation. The federal government's a corporation.
Churches,
They all work with each other and partnership with each other, and that overrides what we can do, what our rights are.
well, it's an improper use of government. Corporate cronyism is really un-American. And there are so many people that have given this aura of respect to an organization that never dies, this corporate kind of nonsense. And we the people need to recognize that our representatives need to rein this in, if you will. That's how we the people choose our representatives. They're to be trusted representatives that understand the limits and bounds. They take an oath of office, whether it's the United States Constitution as a U.S. congressman or senator or president or whatever, or whether it's a state senator or congressman that takes an oath to both the state constitution and the United States Constitution. And these need to be selectively chosen. And right now we don't have enough friends. I keep coming back to that. We the people are responsible, but we don't have enough people. Because, and this will date the presentation, is it Sunday that they got this ball game? Is there? There's a ball game. There's bread and circuses going on Sunday, isn't there? And if you go and read the Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, for example, or the Decline and Fall, I think it is. But at any rate, go read those things. And bread and circuses were one of the elements that brought it down. Illegal immigration brought it down too. This idea of excessive spending, a military-industrial complex, all of these things, we have an analogous position in America today that we can say we're on that path. And I would venture to guess that there are more people interested in somebody that's singing at this upcoming thing than there is in saving the blessings of liberty for themselves and their posterity. We've got to start recognizing the limits and bounds that we can put stuff into stuff that's worthless versus stuff into stuff that has value. And that's where we look to everybody. I think I did a couple-hour radio program this morning, and I told the people, and in a very short, maybe even one sentence, I don't know if I can do anything in one sentence, but there's 4 things we've got to do to save what we've been bequeathed at such great cost. The first one is we got to get right with God. This is a land of liberty under his grand and glorious plan, okay? And it's a gift. And if we're not right, we're not a virtuous people. If we, oh man, we could go over so much about the necessity of virtue. And the Founding Fathers understood this, public and private virtue. That was in the initial inaugural address by George Washington. It continued through his whole administration. Religion and morality were pillars of our liberty, those kinds of things. They understood this. Montesquieu said that if women lose their virtue, the nation will lose its constitution. Montesquieu was one of the mentors of the American founders. So that first thing is getting right with God. I knew I was going to take more than one sentence. Number 2 is understanding the principles the nation was founded on. If we don't understand those, how can we defend them? This limits and bounds of legislative action. They can't delegate authority. A president can't take us to war. No other treaty can override it. I mean, all of these things we just talked about tonight are all essential. But if we don't understand them, we cannot preserve them. The next thing is to get involved. For me, it may be giving talks and running for office occasionally, which is a dreary assignment. But at any rate, giving talks is fun. I mean, because we love this stuff so much. We love to present it to people. You know, this is a microcosm. This group, everybody that's on this, is a microcosm of what makes America great. You know, everybody that loves liberty, we outnumber them. I think we do, but we keep getting distracted. So get right with God, understand the principles and the tradition of the Founding Fathers, get involved, and help others get involved. Those 4 things can bring us liberty. We'll find our back trail, we'll go home the right way. Otherwise than that, we're lost. So that's the kind of thing that's got to happen. It's a tough thing. And you point out all of these, oh, ain't it awful? It's horrid. Yeah, it is. But it took decades a century and a half, century and 2/3, pick your number. We've been dallying with the devil for so long that it's going to take a while, but we got to get moving or we're going to lose it all. And so let's go do those 4 things, I guess. Enoch, you want to talk or?
Yeah, thanks, Scott.
I'll get out of the way just a second. There you go.
Okay, so normally I start off the evening, and I didn't do that today because I was single-handed temporarily and had a lot of new tech. We're trying to broadcast to more places, and so so I apologize about that. But I'm Enoch. I'm the founder of Defending Utah, and I'll just give a quick thought. What Scott was saying, there's a lot of ways to look at the solutions and what we do, and 2013, I started this adventure with the simple thought in mind of if we have a duty to preserve the Constitution, then I'll try some stuff, right? We'll try some things. And in my mind, it's always about giving the Constitution life again. And it wasn't long before I understood this principle the founders talked about called nullification, where I learned about how states early on, when the federal government reached across those boundaries, the states simply said no, very simply, right? It wasn't like, oh, now we got to go educate the federal government on this horrible thing they did, right? It was, they educated them through a law or a declarative statement. We have a number of presentations on this on our YouTube channel where we show Georgia passed the law that said if anyone enforced the court ruling from the Supreme Court, they would hang them in their state, right? You simply, so I realized this power the states had. At the time, they were talking about Obamacare and about, a variety of things. And so we got behind a bill to nullify Obamacare in the state of Utah. I'm like, this is so easy. This is how we give the Constitution life. We just get our legislators to vote no and say not in our state. Well, it wasn't that easy because legislators don't really do their job very well when it comes to constitutional things. But if you look in the history of Utah's legislation in 2014, there's a bill that says nullification of Obamacare. So you think, oh, that must mean in Utah we don't have to buy health insurance, right? You think that's what that means. Well, there's a history behind that. So ourselves and activists from the John Birch Society and a number of other groups got behind this idea, and we got someone to propose the bill, and it was great at first. It was exactly what it sounds like, nullifying Obamacare. But political machinations behind the scenes, right? When you actually get someone to propose a good bill, things happen behind the scenes to make it not happen. This is what I've learned. I've tried this so many times over the years, right? Now, there's a variety of reasons behind that. You could argue, you could say there's, conspiring men. You could then say that there's people that just don't know any better and go along to get along. And I'd say there's some of that, right? Quite often we saw people say, when you privately behind the scenes saying, this is the bill that we need run. And then they look at it and they're all excited to do something for you in the beginning. And then they're just like, oh, I can't run that, right? Pretty common. But, that's a start to at least know what the right thing would be. If you were in office, would you know what the right bill to run would be? If you don't know, you can't really tell your representatives. You can't even really lawfully say your representatives are doing the wrong thing. You don't understand what the right thing would be. Same goes for a city council or county council, commissions and so forth. So then it became, well, if the founders say nullification is the remedy to put the Constitution back in sync and the state won't do it, where do you go from that, right? And so we have a video on our YouTube channel about nullification. It talks about how the nullification is really just the balance of power. The state can do it to the feds, but the county can do it to the state. The city can say no to the county or the state. anybody, wherever you are, whatever office you stand in, you can enforce the Constitution right there. You can dig in your heels and say, not on my watch in this little boring office in the corner of Sandy City, right? So that's the idea. How do we take the Constitution and give it life? So I took that idea and I tried to really expand, where can we implement nullification? Where do you give the Constitution life? And incorporated the ideas of not just legislation and law, but natural law. And we talk about the laws of nature in our presentations. But it all comes down to this little book that I've published in the last couple of years. And just in January, this is the new 12th edition that we just put out. So this is a new edition. I know some of you know about this book, but we get new people and we're hoping to reach a new audience online. And so the reason we do this class here every once a month on a Friday is part of a program that's outlined in here. And that program is to first create more friends, as Scott explained. We need more friends. We need more people who care and have the knowledge. And we want to pass that on to our children, right? There's great work in just having the knowledge. But then once you have the knowledge, many people say, now what do we do about it, right? You bring up all these things, right? That, well, they're doing this and they're doing this, right? So we have to build power bases, and that takes time. New kinds of power bases, and that's what this book talks about, using a pattern the Founding Fathers showed us, where how did they organize when the British Crown was ignoring every law, ignoring all the agreements that they had. The founders in the Declaration of Independence talked about them violating their Constitution. They had this idea that even the king had certain limits to his powers. So what did they do? Well, you look into the history, this book talks about it a little bit, and some of our videos and our training videos online talk about it. You can go to defendingutah.org/committees, and that kind of actually is the starting point to this. So that's why we do that. And for anyone that's interested, we have these books. We usually have a table set up. Right now we don't, because it was kind of cramped today. But if you guys are interested, go through our box. Julia will help look through them. And we have our Secret Combinations book as well. Before we got to the solutions that we are trying to teach today, we spent a lot of time talking about the problem. And the problem being, when you do go to the legislature and have a good idea, how is this opposition organized, right? The founding fathers talked about combinations. Noah Webster talked about the word combinations, both in a good sense and a bad sense. And in the dictionary, he put, in a bad sense, such as a combination of oppression. A combination to overthrow the government is what he put in the dictionary. He was talking about something very specific. They understood the Illuminati threat of the time and what they're up against and so forth. Then they said there's a combination to resist oppression. So a combination is defined as neutral, but you can apply good or evil to it, and so forth. And so when good people combine and they organize what the founders called committees of safety, committees of correspondence, it's just the people exercising the right to assemble, petition for redress, and so forth. So if anyone's interested in that book, if you're online and you go to our website, defendingutah.org, go to contact, we'll send you a free digital copy of the book. You can read about it. But we've also got the physical copies, which are good to study as groups as well. So thank you guys for coming. It was great to see new faces and an audience here. And we had a really good audience online. That was nice to see. Okay, and so the books are $15. And it just helps us keep printing more. And then we also have pocket constitutions and a few miscellaneous things you can look at. So thank you guys for coming. We'll see you next month.
I'd like to squeeze one more.